Well, now it's 4:02, and just out of respect for people's time, let's get started. My name is Duncan Williams, Director of the Ito Center, and we are very pleased today to continue our fall series, which unfortunately, we're still having to do things on an online or Zoom basis. But we've had some fascinating talks so far this semester, and today we're lucky enough to have Nadia Kanagawa of Furman University, assistant professor there, who I think many of us here in the USC community know very well because she's a recent PhD from our university, a scholar of what would we say, not 7th to 9th century, I'm not sure, like Japan, somebody who wrote a brilliant dissertation in the history department, and a few years ago, just as a personal comment, contributed a chapter to a book I did on mixed race, mixed root Japanese people. I think it was called Approach and Be Transformed, Immigrants in the Nara and Heian State. She works on those type of topics around kind of Japan and its multi-ethnic and immigrant character in the earlier centuries. And I believe today will be giving us a talk that comes out of, she's on research leave or sabbatical this semester here in Los Angeles with us from Furman. And so we'll be, I think, speaking about some of the research that's kind of in progress or would even be seeking our comments or feedback, questions. And so the format for today is we'll have Nadia come on, deliver her talk, and it's I believe she has some actual talk formally prepared, but in a casual way, let's receive her and engage in questions, comments, feedback with this work in progress. The title for today's talk is Leveraging the Limitations of Immigrant Descent in Nara, Japan. And I believe she's going to take up the life story of one individual to kind of use as a prism on this subject. But with that, let me turn things over to Nadia Kanagawa.
Hey everybody, I just want to start by saying thank you to Duncan and to everyone at the Ito Center for welcoming me back. I can't tell you how much more I appreciate the library resources at USC now. They have been a miracle. I'm very grateful. And I'm super grateful to have this chance to share some of my recent work. Thank you to Shannon for making all the logistics of being here so easy and worry-free. And thanks to everybody for taking time out of a hectic semester to come and be here. This is a first pass at an article I'm trying to develop, so I really do want any comments or questions that you have. Please don't hold back. Criticism welcome. Let me get my slides up here. Okay, so today I want to tell you the story of one 8th century individual named Fukushin. And I chose this guy because his life brings together a lot of the themes that I'm interested in. So many of them Duncan just mentioned, so assimilation, identity, ethnicity, belonging. But the other reason I chose Fukushin is because he always frustrates my attempts to reach a clean conclusion about what his story means. So he's neither really an entirely marginal figure, even though he's from the provinces, but he's also, he's not really a true central elite, so he kind of is in between those categories. He's born a Yamato subject, but he was descended from a Koguryo immigrant, and that in many ways defined his career. So it's the ambiguity of his position and his success in navigating it that I think make him a really intriguing subject, and make him one that allows us to consider both the limitations and the possibilities of being a person of immigrant descent in the Nara court. So today, in focusing on what a detailed consideration of Fukushin's story can tell us that a wider analysis of Nara laws, systems, and institutions can't tell us, I'm really following in the footsteps of scholars like Brian Lowe and Amy Stanley in exploring microhistory as an approach to pre-modern Japanese history. Okay, so as I understand it, microhistory is not just like a very small scale history, but actually a type of history in which the historian shifts their scale of analysis to show dynamics that are otherwise invisible, that you should be able to see something in a microhistory that you can't see in a macrohistory. A core element of a lot of microhistories is the understanding that social structures are the result of individual choices, negotiations, strategies, and interactions. Or as Giovanni Levi tells us, it's a type of history that, quote, that emphasizes, quote, the irreducibility of individual persons to the rules of large-scale systems, end quote. Okay, so as a result, microhistory is a particularly useful tool for understanding a bureaucracy as a real human experience. And in this vein, in ritualized writing, Lowe used a microhistory to challenge the binary models that tended to pit the state and scribe against each other with an emphasis on state exploitation. So in this chapter, by carefully examining and contextualizing the life of one scriptorium employee, Lowe made it possible to see the ways in which mid and low level officials actually did exercise some agency, even if that agency didn't necessarily mean that they're like directly challenging authority or dramatically overturning norms. But they do have some capacity to dictate some of their circumstances. And they kind of benefited from these situations as well. So today, I'm very much following in Lowe's footsteps, but instead of breaking down state Buddhism, I'm much more interested in complicating the notion of the state itself. Scholars often talk about the Yamato state or the Nara court as if it's a monolith, and it's not. And so in studies of immigrants in the Nara period, that tendency to kind of talk about it as a monolith often ends up in arguments that pit the state or the court against immigrants. So for example, I'm going to pick on Herman Holmes just a little bit because we've talked about this, but in his Imperial Politics and Symbolics, he argues that the official identity of Alakthans, which is his word for immigrants and aliens and refugees, etc., so their official identity was, quote, consciously maintained by the Yamato state, end quote. So models like that fail to fully grapple with the fact that a significant number of the people that made up the state or the court were immigrants or their descendants. So it's possible that they're participating in their own kind of like discrimination or disadvantages. But if that's what's happening, we need a closer view to really understand the dynamics of why they're doing that and how. So examining how Fukushin navigated his status as a person of immigrant descent and an increasingly powerful official allows us to consider how he exercised agency and what the limits of that agency might have been. No need to read this right now, but another key element of writing a microhistory is making the historian's process part of the narrative by weaving in your questions, your hypotheses, your doubts, and your evaluations of all kinds of uncertain evidence. The richest source on Fukushin's life is this, his obituary, which appears in a 789 entry in the official court chronicle known as the Shokuni Hongi, or the Continued Chronicle of Japan. This obituary is full of fascinating elements. It paints quite a picture of Fukushin's life, but it's a part of a court chronicle. It's compiled by a team of officials. It's hardly an unmediated record of his life. They made choices about what to include, what to leave out. In many places, it's obvious that the record is incomplete or inconsistent. Other texts like Shosoin documents from Todaiji, Horyuji, major poetry anthologies, etc., as well as various archaeological sources, are very useful to help both fill in some gaps and reveal others. But even infinite source material couldn't really give us a perfect understanding of how Fukushin saw himself. And so for me, microhistory helps us kind of get comfortable with that limitation, that we can't really know. What makes this source exciting for me is that it contains this sort of tiny echo of Fukushin's voice in the form of a petition that he submitted to the ruler. So it's something that he actually wrote and sent in, even if it's a couple layers removed. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start each section of the talk, and there are 5, some of them are short, with a section of this obituary, which I'll give you a translation of, and then I'll use that as a jumping off point to kind of reconstruct his story and then see what we can learn from it. Okay, so we're going to start with Fukushin's early life in Musashi, and then start at the beginning of the obituary. So it tells us, junior 3rd rank, no post, Takakura no Ason Fukushin died. Fukushin was a person of Koma district in Musashi province. His original designation was Sena. His ancestor was Fukutoku. After Pyongyang was captured by the Tang general Li Ji, he came over to this country and became a person of Musashi. Fukushin was the grandson of Fukutoku. Okay, the obituary starts with Fukushin's origins, and it tells us that he was a person of Koma district in Musashi province. So you might think that he was born, that's where he was born. Let's see, here is Musashi. But in fact, okay, Fukushin could not have been born in Koma district because it didn't exist until 716, while Fukushin was born sometime in the year 709. It's also pretty unlikely that he was born in the place that became Koma district, as the archaeological evidence shows that that area was essentially uninhabited before the creation of the district. So just to give you a sense, not the best image, but this is the area that became Koma district before the creation of the district. Not a whole lot to see here. There had been some settlements in the Jomon period. They rapidly declined in the Yayoi period, not much in Kofun. In this specific area, some stuff nearby. And then after the creation of the district, here you can see all the settlements. So it's really only in the early 8th century after the district was created that you see evidence of wet rice agriculture and enduring settlements in the area. So probably wasn't anything there before. Fukushin could have lived here after 716, but he probably didn't live there before. Another piece of Fukushin's background is that it tells us that his grandfather, Fukutoku, crossed over to Yamato after invading Tang forces seized the capital of Koguryo, highlighted here, in 668. But we don't really know exactly when he came to Yamato. The Nihon Shoki does record groups of people arriving in Yamato from the Korean Peninsula and the Tang Empire, but they don't name Fukutoku, and so we don't know when he came. And there's not really any records that describe a group of people from Koguryo arriving and being settled in Musashi province. There is a specific record of Koguryo people, a group of 56, who arrived in 687 and were settled in Hitachi province, which is close to Musashi, but still not really Musashi. So the most we can say is that Fukutoku arrived sometime after 668 and before 709 when Fukushin was born. We also don't 100% know what happened to Fukutoku when he got to Yamato. So he fled this fall of his kingdom and came over to Yamato. But we can make some educated guesses based on later Ritsuryo or penal and administrative codes. Sorry. Okay, so the process of becoming a Yamato subject was known as submitting and being transformed, or kika or toka. Those are used interchangeably. That process involved arriving and staying in some temporary lodgings, having a kind of description of you sent to the ruler by express messenger, after which you would be transferred to an area with plentiful resources. You would get some land, get some provisions. You would be added to the residence unit registers, and then as a new subject, you would receive a 10-year tax exemption. So pretty good deal. But this process of becoming a subject is very much framed as a transformation that's brought about by the sovereign's civilizing influence. So it was a really critical way for the sovereign to assert the existence and the extent of the realm, which is literally the extent of their influence. That's how it was defined. So it's a critical way for early Yamato sovereigns to support their legitimacy as cosmopolitan Ritsuryo rulers. And this was something that was really important to them. All of that said, unclear how Fukutoku felt about having to present himself as a kind of uncivilized outsider or barbarian in need of transformation, but he probably did go through some version of this process. So even if he got there before the Ritsuryo codes were promulgated, which is possible, the Nihon Shoki suggests that a lot of this process that I just described to you actually was already happening, and so he may have gone through it anyway. So in 681, Temmu is issues an edict extending the 10-year tax exemptions to lifetime tax exemptions. And then there are a bunch of entries from Jito's reign, including the one about the people in Hitachi, that describe the settlement of people from the Korean Peninsula and contain the phrase, quote, "They were allotted fields, given provisions, and made to pursue their occupations in peace," end quote. So basically, Fukutoku was pretty likely to have arrived. He was probably welcomed. He was probably given land and provisions, maybe in Musashi, maybe somewhere else. And then he was added to the registers, and that made him a legal subject of the realm. Okay, so Fukushin was registered in Koma district, or Koma-gun, which the Shokunihongi tells us, as you can see here, was created in 716, when something like 1,800 Koguryo people who were living in 7 provinces across Yamato were resettled in Musashi. And I just want to stress again, these are people that are already living in Yamato, so they have been kind of incorporated to the realm, and they're being resettled in Musashi to form this district. Doesn't tell us why they did this. There's 2 kind of main theories going right now. One from Otsutoru is that the creation of the district was related to a broader pattern of settling new subjects in eastern part of the realm. And basically that sovereigns are kind of taking advantage of immigrants' advanced skills and technologies to open new land. Archaeological evidence on some level supports that argument here. The other main theory from Arai Hideki is that the creation of the district was a part of a diplomatic strategy. And in his view, the existence of this district that is named Koma, which is an abbreviation of Koguryo, so it's basically a district named after and at least ostensibly made up of people from the former realm of Koguryo, was a way of strengthening Yamato sovereigns' claims to having absorbed Koguryo as a realm. So it's something that works for them diplomatically. In either case, it seems like the creation of this district served the interests of the ruler more than the interest of the people who were resettled to create it. So here you get like another view of where this district is. And we might wonder, so once this district is created, how does Fukushin's family fit into that process of creating a district? How do they fit into the community of this district or the world of it? And here Nakamura Yoriaki has recently argued that it would have been difficult for such a large group, 1,800 people, to successfully create a functional district with no local context. Like if they just showed up and there was empty land, it's a pretty tough proposition. So he suggests that maybe Fukushin's family was already in Musashi, they had settled there earlier, and that they played a key role in establishing the district. Hard to prove, but possible. So if that's the case, maybe they served as early district officials, as those people were usually drawn from locally powerful lineages. Some of the recent archaeological finds in this area suggest that the Koma district office may have been located to the north of what's now Musashi Takahagi Station, and they found things like a variety of bronze and stone belt buckles, small dishes, and lacquer documents that kind of give them the sense that this is probably the district office. So another thing that they found there, which I love, is this rare bird-shaped inkstone that's discovered at the Ojin site, which is right nearby. And this inkstone suggests that Koma district had close connections to the capital and provincial headquarters where similar inkstones have been found. So maybe Fukushin grew up watching a family member use this inkstone as they created registers, sent reports to the provincial headquarters, and various other district official activities. Even if not, he definitely grew up in a district where there was an older generation that had actually crossed over from Koguryo, at this point pretty old, assuming they came right after the fall of Koguryo. And there's also a younger generation or two that had been born in Yamato, but are still somehow associated with Koguryo. So you might wonder, like, does this connection to Koguryo mean anything to them? Do they still speak the language? You have to assume that the older generation does still speak the language. Did that older generation pass any traditions on to their children or their grandchildren? You know, the archaeological record really doesn't offer any evidence of distinctive cultural practices. And instead, what you really find in it is that the group of people that lived in this district were connected to other places in Yamato. On some level, that makes sense. They had come from other places in Yamato where they may have been living for decades, but that's what we see. So if that's kind of the evidence, and you know, it had been decades since the fall of Koguryo, maybe these people who founded Koma district had almost nothing in common, other than the experience of being suddenly uprooted and thrown together to serve the ruler's interests. Again, it's very difficult to know, but there's no suggestion that they had kind of meaningful cultural practices that would have united them. Once they got there, maybe they built something. So maybe Fukushin grew up in a place where he had to develop the skill of making friends with people from all across the realm. Would serve him well later. So this is a little bit of where Fukushin is from, the context he grew up in, kind of what's his world. And then from here, I'll talk a little bit about how he gets from Musashi to the capital. So again, returning to the obituary, it reads, when he was young, he followed his uncle Senno no Kobun in coming to the capital. He and his companions were approaching the Isonokami crossroads late at night, where people were playing around and wrestling. He used his strength skillfully and bested his opponent easily. Ultimately, the palace heard about him, summoned, and had him serve in the office of pages. From this time on, his name appeared in the record. First, he was appointed senior lieutenant in the Right Guards. So I love this. I think this is a surprisingly vivid account of how Fukushin got to the capital. And I want to just start by kind of thinking about the actual road he might have taken on this 500 plus kilometer journey. I'm jumping around. All right. In the early 8th century, Musashi was part of the Tosando, or here Tozando, and the shading is off. This is a kind of later map, but you can see the 7 circuits that kind of all of the different provinces are organized into. Musashi is in the Tosando, or the Eastern Mountain Circuit. Given that it's part of that group of provinces, you might think Fukushin and his companions would take the Tosando Highway, but the obituary tells us that they passed through the Isonokami crossroads. And scholars argue that those crossroads are located near present-day Isonokami Ichi Shrine in Tenri City, Nara. So here's where he's going. This is roughly 500 kilometers or more. And I just used modern Google Maps for this, so I apologize. But I wanted to get a sense of what it actually might look like to walk this. And so I kind of imitated the path of the road just to get a basic idea. So if they took the Tosando Highway, which roughly follows this path, not exactly, they would have approached the capital from the northeast. And in order to reach the Isonokami crossroads, they basically have to pass the capital, stop at the crossroads, which is down at the bottom of the screen here, and then double back to the capital. To me, if you just walked 540 kilometers, you're probably not going to walk an extra bit just to go to these crossroads, although maybe they were amazing. I don't know. So it's possible that they did this. I think it's more likely that they took the Tokaido Road, which is a little bit easier to access from Komo District. It's a shorter route overall, and it's also one that kind of takes them more naturally through those crossroads. So I also find it very amusing that the Google map offers like restaurants and coffee and tells you that the roads are closed in the winter. Because travelers throughout time have some things in common. Okay. So at the Isonokami crossroads, they reportedly found a lively scene and an audience in search of entertainment. This is not from the right time period, but it does show a little bit of people wrestling, so I liked this image. The obituary tells us that Fukushin competed in wrestling and easily defeated his opponents. So we kind of learn that this is a skill and strength that makes Fukushin appealing to the ruler. And we can also guess that there's a gap in the record here, right? Like Fukushin does not go straight from the Isonokami crossroads to the palace. But I can tell you that later entries in the Shokuni Hongi do tell us that wrestling was popular among various elites, and specifically that Shomu Tenno enjoyed watching sumo as a sport. So that part kind of checks out. The inclusion of this detail about his skill in wrestling may be a way that the compilers, a way for the compilers to give a sense that Fukushin is strong and capable, and that those are the relevant qualities as he kind of gains the ruler's favor. And it's also a kind of much safer and less controversial thing to do to play up his skill as a sumo wrestler than it would be to kind of praise his military achievements in later rebellions, which are obviously touchy subjects. So in a way, this is a kind of talking about him being this great sumo wrestler is a like, tell me you're a military figure without telling me you're a military figure moment. Okay, so however skilled he was at sumo wrestling, that's not going to sustain a long career as a court bureaucrat. So the bare minimum, he would have had to be literate to hope for an official post. He almost certainly had some kind of education in the provinces. I don't know a lot about that. But what we do know based on this obituary and the record that we have is that it's his uncle, Senano Kobun, who brings him to the capital. And Kolobun appears in several sources as both a kind of scholar and a member of the cultural elite. So I've listed some of them here. In a 721 Shokuni Hongi entry, he is described as something like second professor, senior seventh rank upper, Senano Kimi Kobun. And in that entry, he's in a list of civil and military figures who are, they're getting rewards from Gensho Tenno for their service, and she's sort of like talking about how important they are to the realm. You can also see here that he has a poem in the Manyoshu, and I think 2 in the Kaifuso, where quite importantly, he is identified as the second level official in the university, or the Daigaku. So the university normally accepted students who were between the ages of 13 and 16, whose parents were of the 5th rank or higher. But they could make exceptions for people whose parents were 8th rank or higher and who, expressed a strong desire to attend. We don't know, based on the existing records, what Fukushin's father's rank was, or if he had any rank. But Kolbun is promoted to the 5th rank in 727. He's serving in the university. It seems pretty likely that he could have helped Fukushin to get into the university if he really wanted to, and that would have been a great first step in preparing for a career as an official. The obituary also tells us that Fukushin's career began in the office of pages, or the Naijusho. This office is an extracodal office. It's not defined in the Ritsuryo codes, but from what we can tell, a page seems to have been a relatively low-level official who served close to the ruler. Just to clarify, the translation page may suggest a young person or a child, but actually adults could also serve in these posts. And Nakamura points out that there is this 757 document from the Todaiji Construction Agency, which includes this signature here. And here you can see that Fukushin has signed page Komano Ason Fukushin. So this is 757. At this point, Fukushin would have been something like 47 years old. So it seems like he retained this title and this position well into his career. So even as he's getting other promotions, getting other appointments, he still holds this position of page, which kind of brings him close to the ruler. The first Ritsuryo post that Fukushin held was in the right outer palace guards, whose members guarded the gates of the Tenno's palace. I don't have a lot of time to get into like all the intricacies of these guard units, which are constantly changing and quite confusing. But according to the laws on promotions, a person had to be at least 25 years old to serve in these guides. So we can assume that the appointment took place sometime in or after 734, which would have put it right in the middle of the smallpox epidemic that killed so many people, including, the 4 Fujiwara Fujito's sons. And if we assume that Fukushin arrived in the capital when he was between the ages of 13 and 16, would have been appropriate for the university, then he had been in the capital about 10 to 12 years at this point. He's only beginning to make his name, but the guard appointment would mark the beginning of his career as a significant military figure in the Nara court. So we've already got some themes going here. 1, military skill, and 2, he's got a close relationship with the ruler, who is at this point Shomu Tenno. And so far, he's really just using connections and his skills and talents to get his kind of toehold to launch his career, much like you would expect basically anybody in the realm to do. So from here, I want to look a little bit at his career in the capital. So here, the section is a little bit longer, the Japanese is on the next slide, but I'll read you from the obituary what it says about the middle part of his career. After a while, he was transferred. In the Tempyo era, he was granted outer junior 5th rank lower and appointed 2nd level manager in the Crown Prince's palace. Shomu Tenno showed him great personal favor. At the beginning of the Shoho era, he had reached the junior 4th rank and junior 2nd level manager of the Shibichudai. And his original designation was revised, and he was granted Komano Ason. He was also transferred to 2nd level official of the Ministry of Central Affairs. In the first year of the Jingo era, he was granted junior 3rd rank and appointed director of palace construction. He concurrently served as Musashi and Omi governor. Lots going on there. It leaves out even more. So this section covers the most significant years of his career, roughly 738 to 776. And unlike earlier sections, we can use a lot of other sources to figure out what they're including and what they're leaving out. And kind of, to some extent, think about why, but also here I'm going to kind of draw on other things to fill in some of the things that aren't in this source. But for the sake of time, we can't actually go step by step through every piece of his career. I'm going to focus on 3 pieces here. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually in the middle. It's this idea that he receives the new designation, becomes Koma no Asam. The second thing I'm going to focus on are his court alliances. So here you can see there's Shomuten no shows some great favor. Think a little bit about that. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about his appointment specifically as Musashi provincial governor. Okay, so I'm going to start with designations. In order to talk about that and kind of explain what's going on here, I have to give a bit of a crash course in 2 key Yamato status systems. So first, royally recognized lineages, or uji, and then second, royally granted titles, or kabane. So just for context, what are these things? How do they work together? What is a designation? So uji are, this is a very old system in Yamato. They are created by rulers through the grant of a lineage name. They're usually granted in recognition of significant service to the throne. So they create this kind of direct bond between the ruler and the group. And these uji names tended to be based either on places or on the type of service the lineage participated in, but there's other types. Those are just the 2 most common. And once you had one, once you'd received this grant, it could be passed on to future generations. And in the case of like the Fujiwara, the most obvious case, this tended to sprawl out very quickly. The other major system are the kabane, or royally granted titles. These are also bestowed by the sovereign as rewards for meritorious service. So they also mark a direct relationship between the subject and the ruler. And they were often, but not always, received in conjunction with royal recognition as a lineage. So one of the things that they do is they likely serve to indicate the relative status of the lineages. And most famously, in the late 7th century, Tenmu created this system of 8 kabane that are very much hierarchically ranked, right? Like Mahito is the top, mostly for royals. Ason, Tsukune, Imiki are kind of the important ones, and then everything below. 2 of these are almost never used. And then Omi and Moraji are kind of older ones that you see a lot in the Nihon Shoki, but not so often later on, or less often. Okay, so together, these things make up what I call a designation. It's basically the part of a person's name that's left when you take away their personal name. And just to be clear, let's look at an example. So here's a person's full name and designation. Tachibana no Sukune Moroe. This part, Tachibana, is the royally recognized lineage name. This part is, you just saw it on the last slide, the royally granted title. And so when sorry, no, that's not moving. Okay, Moroe is his personal name, and then Tachibana no Sukune is what I'm calling the designation. So when I talk about the designation system, it's both of these things together. Okay, back to Fukushin. These designations are a real cornerstone of royal authority because only the sovereign can grant them and revoke them. So at the end of the day, it has to be a ruler. There's a lot of process involved, but the ruler has to actually do it. The legal codes do not have a process for deciding if, when, or how to integrate new subjects into the designation system. So a lot of kind of foreign subjects, new subjects would come in who had immigrated and become subjects. They don't have designations. There's not a system for giving them one once they've arrived. And just to give you a sense of like kind of the scale of this system and how much it mattered to people, between the late 7th century and the early 9th, there are something like 10,000 designation grants or changes that were recorded in the official histories. That's not limited to immigrants and their descendants. All sorts of subjects are participating in this, literally from royalty to people who are former slaves. All of them are kind of part of that large number and part of this process. So I think we can say pretty obviously that this matters to a lot of people, ruler subject alike. To get to Fukushin's names, his original designation is probably Senna no Kimi Fukushin. And the first change to that is actually not to Koma no Asan, but to Senna no Konikishi, which is a designation that he and 8 members of the Senna lineage received in 747. So what's going on with this kind of Konikishi, right? Like the character that you see here, hopefully you can see here, is usually king or prince, and it is used that way to refer to Yamato royalty. But it's first used as a kabane or a title in 693 CE, when Jito Tenno granted descendants of a Paekje king the designation Kudara no Konikishi, which you see here, which effectively is Kudara is Paekje, and then Konikishi implies royal. So creating this title allowed Yamato rulers like Jito to proclaim to Shilla and the Tang, among others, that the royalty of the fallen Korean polities now held the title of royal at the Yamato sovereign's pleasure. So she gets to give them that title because they are now part of her realm. The title Konikishi is only ever granted to 3 lineages, and they are the Kudara no Konikishi, the Koma no Konikishi, and the Sena no Konikishi, which is our guy Fukushin's designation. So looking at this, Koma clearly an abbreviation of Koguryo, similar to the district. We can see that Kudara and Koma refer to Paekje and Koguryo respectively, but we might wonder, like, how does Sena fit in here? It's not the name of a state. And the argument that I find most convincing is from Sugasawa Yoko, who said this designation is meant to imply that Parhe, which is the sort of successor state to Koguryo, kind of created by Shilla, that it's meant to imply that Parhe also submitted to Yamato, but Parhe still exists, unlike Paekje and Koguryo, so they can't actually use that name. So instead, they kind of stick with Sena, and that's the Uji name. So we might wonder here, Sena, Fukushin's been given this new designation, Sena no Konikishi. How does he feel about this? A lot of these designation changes were probably granted in response to requests from the people who received them, but we don't know if Fukushin asked for this change. So this is Shomu Tendo who's granting it to him. In many ways, Shomu Tendo is following in the footsteps of earlier rulers. He's using this Konikishi title to enhance Yamato's stature in the region. But we also know from the obituary that Shomu Tendo particularly liked Fukushin, that he was a favorite of his. And you can track that in the record. I mean, Fukushin advanced very quickly in rank during Shomu's reign. He's junior 4th rank upper by 749. That's pretty impressive rise. He gets promoted pretty quickly. So on some level, maybe we have to suspect that this change actually serves both of their interests. These designations are super critical to advancing at court. The fancier your name was, the higher status you were, the easier it was to gain entry and to then rise through the court. And Fukushin's original kabane of Kimi is not particularly high status, so that wouldn't have helped him much. We also know from Shokunin Hongi records that the Kudara no Konikishi were among a small handful of elite lineages that were consistently getting high ranks. And this is a little bit later on, but potentially Fukushin can see that this is a pretty advantageous title to get. You might also assume that, like, who's going to be really mad at the implication that they're descended from royalty, even if that connection is kind of like distant or imagined. But in any case, this Sena no Konikishi title doesn't last very long. 3 years later, Koken gives 6 members of the Sena no Konikishi lineage the designation Koma no Ason, and this is the name that we saw in the actual obituary that they highlight. So they left the earlier kind of like Konikishi name out. When Koken gave him this designation, she set a precedent. This is the first time that a lineage of immigrant descent received the Ason title that I know of. And that Ason title is the second highest of the kind of 8 Tenmu titles. And it's also the highest that's available to non-royal. So Mahito is really for a prince who is no longer a royal, who's kind of been moved out of the royal family. So we might ask, like, why is she making this change so soon after the last grant? And the best explanation I've seen is from Tanaka Fumio, who argued that in the years following this change, a bunch of members of this Koma no Ason lineage get appointed as diplomatic envoys to foreign states. But none of the remaining Sena no Konikishi were given similar appointments. So on that basis, he's making the point that Koken changed the title because she knew it wouldn't be acceptable to other realms if they showed up with the Sena no Konikishi name. And in fact, like, if you imagine a Yamato envoy showing up in Parhe claiming to be a Parhe royal, that would be weird and probably pretty threatening. So you can kind of see the logic of it. So again, for me, I wonder, like, how does Fukushin feel about any of this? Is he frustrated that he has to now use the name of the country that his grandfather came from as his lineage name? Like for me, it's like if I'm suddenly going to become like Nadia, Germany or Japan, it's a little weird. Or is he maybe just very happy to receive the Ason title, which was very high status and prestigious, probably helped him at court. It could easily be a little bit of both, or maybe he's the one who came up with this. Maybe he asked for this title because he wanted to advance the lineage. It's pretty clear that he and his family members benefited from the new designation in the form of official appointments, so as envoys and otherwise. And here I just want to pause to make one small point, which is that a number of scholars in talking about the Nara period have argued that quote unquote native elites are using these designations to keep immigrants separate and subordinate in Yamato. So people like Cornelius Kiley and Omzian have argued that designation changes in the latter part of the 8th century allowed immigrant officials to gain access to rank and office by, quote, obscuring their foreign origin, end quote. And I think Fukushin's story pretty obviously demonstrates the flaws in some of those arguments, right? Like his name could not more obviously signal his foreign origin, and it is part of what allows him to rise in the court. So they don't have to hide where they're from in order to get offices. And so here we can see that rulers are using these designations to highlight foreign origin of some of their subjects, and that the subjects who are getting those designations could often benefit quite significantly from that connection. So with that, I'll leave these designations aside for now and kind of talk a little bit about Fukushin's kind of time, how he navigated the turbulent times of the mid-8th century. So he really does live in very turbulent times. And what's interesting is that almost none of these crises are in the obituary, right? Partly because it's sensitive, also, it's in a historical record where they've already talked about this. But the record shows that Fukushin has this sort of like incredible ability to pick the winning side in a conflict. So I'm just going to very quickly go through some of the major conflicts that he saw and kind of how he came through them, just to give you a sense of that. And then we'll talk a little bit about what it was that let him do that. So the first is 757, Tachibana no Naramaro, who's one of the major ministers at court, gets kind of upset. Koken's taking the throne. He sees that Fujiwara, in particular Fujiwara Nakamoto, are gaining power. He's kind of losing out. And so he begins to plot to seize power from Queen Consort Komyo and Fujiwara Nakamoto, and he's going to replace Koken Tenno with a more amenable prince. So this is the plot. And in this plot, which is eventually exposed, Fukushin is one of the key military figures. And he not only avoids a trap set for him by the plotters, and I love this, they were going to invite him to a drinking party outside of the capital to get him out of the way. But he also helps to successfully pursue and capture these plotters. So he's on the right side here, gets rewarded for it. The next one, not too long after, is in 764. And so in the space of time, Koken has abdicated in favor of Junnin, who's taken the throne as Junnin Tenno, but she kind of retains some control. And her relationship with Nakamoto, who had formerly been a close ally, starts to deteriorate quite rapidly after her mother Komyo dies in 760. So these kind of former allies are now at odds with each other. When Koken moves to regain full control of the court, Nakamoto responds with force. And so they kind of break out into this military conflict. And we don't really know exactly what Fukushin is doing here or what his role was, but Koken wins. And she retakes the throne as Shotoku in 764, at which point she, issues an edict in which she kind of grants promotions as rewards for those who helped her win. And Fukushin's name is listed second out of 140 people in that list. And not only that, he's granted junior third rank. And I know I keep saying this rank, it's hard to understand, like you seem to think that's impressive, but like, what does that mean? So just to give you a sense of it, like being granted junior third rank, he's granted that with, I think, 14 other people that year, but it makes him one of the top 20 people in the realm. So there's only 20 people who have that rank or higher in the entire country. So under Shotoku, the monk Dokyo famously rises to power. He's named Prince of the Law, etc. And during this time, Fukushin was appointed both Director of Palace Construction, which we saw in the obituary, and the director of a new office that was going to build the palace for Dokyo as Prince of the Law, which is not in the obituary. So this seems to suggest some sort of close connection to Dokyo. But even when Dokyo, has the whole Hachiman Oracle incident and is disgraced and cast out, Fukushin kind of comes out unscathed. He's fine. He keeps his position as the director of palace construction. And I think we can kind of look at this and say, like, this is a pretty remarkable run. How is he doing this? And I think without question, he's a competent and reliable military figure. He's a talented official, etc. But that's not enough of an explanation. So I want to go back to the obituary and look at a couple of clues. One, we know Fukushin entered the capital around the time Shomu took the throne, and that he served close to Shomu as a page and possibly continued to do so. Oh, sorry, here I had that. Okay, so he possibly continued to serve Shomu as a page throughout Shomu's life. So that's his first appointment. In 743, he was appointed to the Crown Prince's palace. And so we get a sense that, like, not only is he close to Shomu, he has his favor, but he also has his trust. It's important to note that the Crown Prince in whose palace he served was not a prince, but a princess, Abe, who went on to rule as Koken Shotoku. So also worth noting, the head of the Crown Prince's palace at that time was none other than Kibi no Makibi, the future minister of the right and critical advisor and ally to Koken for much of her career. The obituary also tells us that Fukushin served in the Shibichudai, which is the expanded queen consort's household agency that was headed by Fujiwara no Nakamaro. This is often viewed as like the key to Nakamaro's domination of the court at this time. And people often talk about like Nakamaro Seiken, like this is his time, this is his world. But I think we should really remember that the Shibichudai also allowed Koken to rule by issuing edicts directly without going through the Council of State. So in a sense, it really served her as ruler in its kind of conception. And if we look at it that way, I think it eventually becomes clear that the through line in Fukushin's career was his loyalty first to Shomu and then to Koken Shotoku. So he wasn't ever actually really switching sides. Like if you try to think about like which minister he was buddied with, doesn't make any sense. But if you realize that he's really affiliated with Shomu and then Koken Shotoku, you can understand that he's always on the same side actually in these conflicts. And here I think we get another small glimpse at what he had to offer rulers like Shomu and Koken, which is exactly his undivided loyalty as an official who's not part of an established lineage, and he's not part of any of the factions at court when he gets there. He has some connections, but he's not like an entrenched part of this world. So I think that might be part of the reason that he makes it through all of this, seemingly without any scratches on him. Okay, so finally, in this section, I want to talk a little bit about his time as Musashi governor. He is, as far as I know, Fukushin, the only person who was kind of registered from a province that was also appointed the governor of that province 3 times in their career. So he's appointed the governor of Musashi 3 times. His first appointment isn't actually recorded in the Shokuni Hongi, and it's not mentioned in the obituary, but he signs this document. Oh, he signed a 756 Todaiji document with his official appointments, which were at the time in the 6th month, Shibichudai official and Tajima governor. And then in the following 7th month, he signs this Horyuji document with these 2 titles. And here you can see down here that he is signing that he is the Musashi governor. So he must have been appointed sometime between the 6th and 7th month here, couple week period. Okay, so that's his first appointment. So he is appointed in 756, concurrently serving in the Shibichudai. His next appointment is sometime later in 770, and at that time he's concurrently serving as the director of palace construction. 783, last appointment under Kammu, and at that point he is concurrently serving as the head of the board of censors. So looking at all of this, Nakamura makes the case that Fukushin's probably not in residence in Musashi at any point, right? Like he's always concurrently serving in a position in the capital, and the evidence that we have, all these documents from Todaiji and other places, suggest that he's performing duties related to those positions pretty regularly. So it's very unlikely that he like moved to Musashi to be the governor there. And absentee appointments to provincial positions were increasingly common during this time. So he's appointed to a bunch of other places as well, Yamashiro, Tajima, Omi. And this is kind of a larger strategy, and I'm kind of like crashing through this, there's much more to say about it, but it's part of a larger strategy used by rulers to ensure that key officials are rewarded with additional sources of financial support if they serve in a capital. So if he doesn't live in Musashi as the governor, what's his relationship to the province? Is it just like a source of income to him? Or does his connection to this place actually shape how he acted as a governor? He might have traveled back and forth, but if he did, we don't have any evidence. Not a short journey, so I don't know. That said, he probably did maintain a connection to the area through other members of his family. We can see here, I just kind of recorded some of the times that other members of his lineage served in the Musashi provincial government. So Komano Ason Oyama, who I'm not totally sure what their relationship is. It might be like a cousin or something like that, but they often appear together in the record. He obviously received the Komano Ason designation. He serves as lieutenant governor, and then Fukushin's son, Komano Ason Iwamaro, also serves as lieutenant governor a little bit later. So these family members and others who might have still been there may have provided a link back to the province, and they might have given him the network he needs to kind of collect taxes and oversee the government, et cetera. But they also might have kind of relayed the concerns of the province to Fukushin in the capital. And the reason I think that is that he oversees a couple of really key developments in Musashi that suggest that he might have used his position to advocate for the interests of the province. The first of those, and I'm going to try to move quickly here, is the creation of Shila District in 758. So this is very similar to the creation of Koma District. They basically move a bunch of Shila people who are already in Yamato to Musashi and have them create a new district named after Shila. So who knows exactly why this happened? Are there people in the province? We know there were Shila people already there. Are they kind of appealing to Fukushin and saying like, hey, we'd like to have our own district like Koma District? Maybe he thinks this is a good way to open new land. Here we can see very clearly that they're being moved to unopened land, uncultivated land, or maybe just the ruler thinks Koma District was a great success and he wants another one. Why not appoint the guy who was there when Koma District was set up as the governor? In any case, this is clearly something that kind of Fukushin would have been responsible for as the governor at the time. The second thing that's a big deal for Musashi is that under his second term, I think, Musashi province is moved from the Tosando circuit to the Tokaido circuit. And there is a 771 kind of Council of State edict that makes this change, and it also gives this like long explanation of how envoys are having to go, how many stations they have to pass through, why it's so inconvenient, and then they talk about like the grave losses of this inefficiency. So that's the reason they give for switching Musashi from the Tosando to the Tokaido. And we know that Fukushin experienced this at least once in his life. And I've argued that he made the choice to go Tokaido instead of Tosando because it was shorter. And so we can imagine this is a huge, you can't quantify it exactly, but our cheating Google Map analysis suggests that they could have saved at least 40 kilometers off the journey if they make this switch. And in a time period when dying by the side of the road is a very significant problem that we see over and over and again in the records, you have to imagine that this is a good thing for Musashi province and the people that live there. So even if Fukushin never went back to Musashi at any point, it still seems like he's advocating for his province over 50 years later. So some kind of connection must have been meaningful to him. Okay. And here is the part where we actually get into the petition. So Takakura no Ason, and I'll just read it first. In the 10th year of the Hoki era, he presented a document saying, "It has already been many years since I submitted to your numinous influence. Although one might say I have been excessively honored with the receipt of the new title of Ason, I still have not shed the name Koma, which is based on old manners. I humbly request that Koma be revised and that I be made Takakura." A written command was issued and this was permitted. So this petition from probably 779, when he actually gets that name or that designation, it's so mediated, right? Like layers and layers of bureaucratic process and editorial selection before we get this little piece of text. But it's still this glimpse of his voice, this kind of like echo even though it's like super faint, that makes him really fascinating to me. Like this is his actual will and voice on some tiny level. So you get this kind of glimpse of Fukushin as an active participant in the designation system. Here he's trying to get something that he wants. So we actually know that he wanted this name. And we can see a little bit of the strategy that he chose in trying to get it. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that he had options of different strategies to choose from. And I'll talk about those in a bit, but there's something like 50 petitions in the first 3 official histories. We think that most changes were in response to petitions, but we don't have all of them, but there are about 50. And what I can say about them is that they preserve a really surprising range of different strategies that subjects used when they tried to get new designations. So there's a whole bunch of different strategies. It's not the case that everybody's using the same line to get their new designation. So what choices did Fukushin make? What do those choices tell us about like how he sees the world, how he saw himself, what he's trying to do here? So I want to start by focusing on this phrase where he ties himself to the rhetoric of submitting and being transformed, right? So he's saying like, it's already been a long time since I did that. The language is a little ambiguous. It seems like he's saying he did it. Of course, it was actually his grandfather. Either way, Japanese being what it is, it's unclear exactly who he's referring to. But if we're talking about his grandfather, it was a long time ago. It was at least 70 years ago and as many as 110 years ago. So yeah, they've been in Yamato for a while. The next thing that he does is he kind of pauses to acknowledge the honor of having received the Ason title from Koken. And then he laments that he still has the uji name Koma. So he like talks about being excessively honored with the title, but he's still apparently humbled by the uji name. And he goes on to explain that the name Koma is based on old manners. And that is a really key phrase that helps us understand what his strategy is here and what the basis for his request is. So you have to flash back a little bit to an earlier edict from Koken in 757. She makes this at like a very key time in her reign when she's sort of like setting aside Shomu's choice as her successor and putting in place a new person. So this is a pretty big deal edict. She goes through a long explanation and justification for what she's doing. She issues an amnesty, she grants all these rewards. And then at the end, there's this curious little chunk of text that reads, regarding the people from Koguryo, Pekche, and Shila, who long ago came here yearning for the numinous influence of the monarch, and who have adopted our manners, all requests to be granted a designation shall be approved. So a couple things going on here. One, she is on some level following in Shomu's footsteps. He had already started to try to include every subject in the designation system, which, there had been all these like gaps in it. And so he was trying to close the loop and make sure everybody's in it. On some level here, she's saying like all of the people who immigrated here, whenever that was, if you don't have a designation yet, you should get one. But she's adding a step. So that's the key thing, is that she adds this idea that you have to adopt our manners. I think it's important to know that there are no specific manners that you have to adopt. She doesn't list them here, following grants, following petitions. There's never a reference to any kind of custom, lifestyle, culture that people are changing. They're not saying like, I now bury my family in this way, or my hair is different, or I don't eat this anymore. Nothing. It's just like, I've been here a long time. Can I have a designation? And so what I've argued is that this is really about her being able to grant a designation and like symbolically transform a person a second time, right? So this Kika process has now become 2 steps. You arrive, you submit, you're put in the register, so you're a subject, then you adopt our customs, and then you get a designation. So she doesn't have that many immigrants, but this lets her kind of participate in that process. So if we compare the edict and the petition, you can see the kind of language that's connected. So Fukushin's definitely drawing on Koken's edict as the basis for getting a new name and for asking for. He talks about old manners being the reason that he still has this Koma no Ason name. Obviously, he doesn't have a problem with the Ason part. It's really hard to believe that he's the intended target of Koken's original edict, right? She had just given him a new designation. He'd had a designation before that granted by a ruler. Probably not the person she's talking about, but she does say that like anybody can get what they ask for. And the petition is successful. He gets the name that he's asking for. So evidently it was persuasive. And here I want to also just for a second emphasize how many other options he had. So there are other lineages, including immigrant lineages, that submit petitions that completely ignore this policy. they just talk right past it and they say like, we are descended from such and such a glorious ruler, usually of, whatever continental or peninsular kingdom. And we've been here a long time. We have contributed in all these ways to Yamato, and we would now like a new name. There's others who say, my name is too closely tied to this profession, and me and my lineage are too incompetent to serve in that profession, so we want this other name. And these are all successful petitions. And there's also people who are just like, my name's confusing, I want a different one. There's all kinds of different things that he could have said, and instead he chose to use this justification. So he's making an active choice here and probably thought this was his best chance of succeeding. The last thing I want to talk about is why Takakura? What did that mean to him? So I think the most obvious thing is that it's not the name of a Korean kingdom, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the explanation. There are other petitions from this time that suggest that people didn't want designations that implied a connection to immigrant descent or to other countries. The guy that Brian Lowe actually focuses on, his lineage is called Karakuni no Mudaji, which is kind of like, Karakuni meaning like Korean Peninsula, a foreign country. They got that because they were envoys, but later in the 8th century, they sort of say like, we're not from this place and everybody thinks we are, and they're astounded and horrified. And so we want a new name. So there's some suggestion that people don't like these names that associate them with foreign countries. But it's also a time when the Kudara no Konikishi and Kanmu were very close and they're doing super well. So it's not totally clear that the Koma no Asan name would have been disadvantaging Fukushin. But he seems to have thought it would be better to have a different name. And Takakura, where does this come from? It's probably a place name. That's a very common basis for choosing a name. That's not surprising, doesn't break any precedents. So he's playing it pretty safe there. One other thought here is that, why does he ask for this? At this point, Fukushin was promoted to the 3rd rank a while ago. It's been almost 15 years. And for all of those 15 years, he hasn't received any promotions. At one point, he finished his construction on the Yamamomo Palace, and he's rewarded, but the reward is a promotion in rank for his son and not for him. So he may have hit a kind of max capacity for his career, and now he's thinking about how can he set his son up? Maybe he thinks that being Koma no Ason is somehow limiting him. So I don't know exactly why he wants this name, but evidently he does. Okay, I'm gonna just wrap up really quickly. He eventually retires. So he's appointed director of Board of Centers, Musashi governor again. He then asks to step down and is allowed to do so. And then he dies at the age of 81. And we don't know a whole lot about what he's doing in retirement. Does he go back to Musashi? It says he goes to his residence, but where is that? I don't know. I just wonder, is he looking back on this career, which I think is pretty impressive and incredible, and he's feeling satisfied, or is he worried about the future? So he's kind of taken these steps to set his son up, hopefully on this path to promotion at the court, but the conditions have gotten harder. The elite families are stronger. He's maybe worried that Iwamaro, his son, is going to face more significant challenges than he had, and he might have been right about that. So Iwamaro's highest position is lieutenant governor in a provincial government, so he doesn't make it that high. And the Takakura no Ason also doesn't really work. It's not even in the Shinsen Shojiroku at all, the later record of all court lineages. So whatever the reasoning was that he wanted this, I don't think it turned out the way he wanted it to. So, okay, with that, I'll just kind of wrap up and say, Fukushin still frustrates me. I want him to be this example of an immigrant whose achievements kind of disprove the idea that the Yamato court is kind of trying to keep immigrants distinct and under the control specifically of native elites. And I do think that this shows it was much more complicated than that. But I also, his immigrant descent is very critical to his career at court. So time and again, his story shows us ways in which Yamato rulers tried to use subjects who were of immigrant descent to their advantage. They create these districts, they grant these designations, they're using them for their lack of affiliation to others. At the same time, we can hardly deny that Fukushin is benefiting from this treatment, nor could we claim that he's doing that unintentionally. So on some level, they needed each other to make this work. And for me, it's really like this petition that fits the idea of like the irreducible individual of microhistory. It's a bit incoherent to like heavily emphasize your immigrant descent in a petition in which you try to get a name that doesn't reflect immigrant descent. But those are Fukushin's choices. So in the end, I hope that this story, this narrative, has made it possible to understand how his petition could reflect both that kind of willingness to leverage the narrative of submitting and being transformed, and his clear longing to escape from the limitations that that imposed on him. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Very much welcome questions. Oh, I have a slogan for microhistory: why make things simple when you can make them complicated? All right.
Nadia, thank you so much for your presentation. There's a lot there, and love that last quote. So I'm going to just, open it up for, as Nadia was saying earlier, not just questions for clarification of something she presented, or, questioning something about her presentation, but adding comments or reflections, feedback that might be useful to take this research presentation to another stage and so forth. So I think we're just open for comments, open for reflections, as well as any kind of clarifying questions. And so, Nadia, do you see people in the group? There are questions that people did write. There's one in the Q&A thing already, but I think we're open for people to make their questions not just in the Q&A, but if they would like to put it in the chat, or if they, anything is fine. So Nadia, do you want to start with the one that's in the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let me see. So from Paula Curtis, how often do we find these kinds of transformations among those who are ostensibly immigrants, going from what we might consider part of a profession quite far from one who inherited courtly or scholarly pursuits to a court official? Are there other notable people who also have this experience that make Fukushin more or less particular? Let me see, maybe if I post it here, you can see it. Yeah, so yeah, the use of transformations there is like throwing me off a little bit, because I usually use it in terms of that like transforming into becoming a subject. But here, yeah, arguably Fukushin is going from being a kind of provincial figure to being somebody who's really part of these capital, relative elites. I don't think he's the only person that this happens to. In some ways, Kibino Makibi, I think, is pretty similar. Even higher, maybe he's minister of the right, and pretty unaffiliated, although not necessarily of immigrant descent. He does spend a long time in the Tang. So there are other people that do this. You might also think like a little bit later, Borgen's work on Sugawara no Michizane, he has that great article on the Haji family. So that's a family that kind of like bootstraps is the wrong word, but like works their way up this system, and then eventually has one great figure who really makes a splash at the court. So there are other people that do this, especially if they're coming from like a pretty powerful lineage in a particular region. But I think this is not like every person's story. It's pretty hard to get into these court ranks. So another part of the situation is just like everybody has to use everything they can to get as far as they can in the court. It is kind of a zero-sum game. So I think he's using everything he's got to rise through the ranks. And in his effort to do that, he's not that dissimilar than others. He just happens to be more successful. I'm not totally sure that answered your question, but I think he's not completely unique, but he is, people of the time were probably impressed at his rise. Questions?
And Nadia, maybe just to follow up on that question of like how idiosyncratic is this one individual versus what are some of the larger patterns you've been seeing and noticing in your research of, I know he's not the only person you studied, like you studied a lot of different people, have probably noticed certain kinds of patterns in terms of how much or how centrally included persons of immigrant descent or even immigrants themselves are in the court structure. And I wonder if you can give us also a little bit of a sense of that, those larger kind of patterns you've noticed.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of picked on him because he was an interesting person and had like sort of fun elements to the story. But maybe the bigger story of roughly the same time period is that Kudara no Konikishi family, which, there's only maybe 8 families that are consistently in the inner ranks that are always kind of at these higher levels, and they're one of them. And so when people argue that like immigrants couldn't rise through the ranks unless they like pretended to be native elites, obviously no, right? Like this is also a family whose name could not more obviously reference a foreign country. They're very elite. They aren't necessarily serving as like the minister of the right or the left, the actual highest positions. But one of the things I struggle with is how much does that tell us? Like, is there a glass ceiling, or is it just that like only 1 or 2 people get to be the highest minister in the country? So none of them ever really serve in that position, but I don't know if that tells us that there's like a huge disadvantage for immigrants. More broadly than those kind of elite families, and the Kudara no Konikishi in particular benefit from a connection to Kanmu Tenno, who sort of famously has, his mother is said to be of Korean descent. Her claim to being descended from Paekje royalty is a little dubious, but Kanmu sort of ties her family to the Kudara no Konikishi family, who have a stronger claim there. And so he refers to them as his maternal relatives. So there are these kind of like elite families, but in a broader sense, again, Tsugasawa has argued that you see more and more people of immigrant descent kind of getting provincial government positions later in the 8th century. So early on, you don't see that many. And some scholars have argued that that means like immigrants couldn't get these positions. But her point is like they had to break into the court ranks and they needed some time to rise. And so she argues, based on analyzing all these provincial government positions, that that's just the appropriate amount of time for them to get to that level and start to get those appointments. And I found that a pretty persuasive argument. So I think some of it is just working their way up in the system. And then even early on, there's a lot of people serving as officials in the court. So I think the idea that they're kind of like being kept separate and seen as less is at the very least too simple.
So Nadia, there are more questions in the Q&A, as well as I see one in the chat as well. I don't want to force you to take it in particular order or another, but I wonder, based on the answer you just gave, if there's a question that kind of nicely tags off of that amongst ones raised by there's Brooke McCallum, Edward McCammons, and Walthall in the Q&A, and then from Sachiko Kawai in the chat.
Oh, okay. I'm maybe just going to go in order because I'm not sure I can process and choose.
Yes. Okay.
So I'll answer Brooke. So Brooke said, I would be interested to learn what the perception around the fluidity of naming may have been among the kind of peerage or the elite. Does the perception of one individual getting ahead by using administrative means appear in specific sources or exchanges among his contemporaries? Not totally sure I understand the question, but I will say, so one of the things that I did was I made this database of 10,000 designation grants and changes. So everybody is really playing this game. Like they're all trying to get the most advantageous designation that they can. And those like the status attached to a designation becomes more important over the course of the 8th century. So they like playing the game even more. And you'll see things like the Abe lineage will submit a petition saying like, long ago we were all one family, but now we've been split into 6 and this should not be, and we should all be merged back into the Abe lineage, which is to me a little bit crazy, right? Because the ruler is the one who split you into 6 lineages. Why is it that that should not be? And why does the ruler then accept that logic and allow them to merge back into one? This happens at a time when that Abe lineage is quite powerful. So you can understand why the other kind of the formerly affiliated lineages want to be merged back in. And I think the key is just having sponsorship from a powerful person at court. So this certainly isn't limited to people of immigrant origin. Everybody is doing this. And it was pretty common. I don't know that I've ever seen somebody complaining about someone else's title, although you have to imagine that that happened. But I haven't seen that in the record. So most of this is in Shokunihongi, like the official chronicles is where I'm finding it. So hopefully that answers a little bit of what you were asking. And then let's see, a question from Ed Kamens, who says, let's see. Okay, I appreciate your close reading of the obituary and related texts. You take names and titles and other details seriously. Whereas along the lines of what microhistory works against, these might easily be overlooked or their significance taken for granted. So you said at the conclusion that Takakura's surname didn't seem to survive with his lineage, but is there any way to think about why he asked for that particular name among others? Can we interpret its own significance? So what is that name? It's hard. I think so. The best explanation I've seen for where it came from is that it's a place name, and that's really commonly what people are asking for. Is they're trying to get a place name. So it's obviously a Yamato place as opposed to the name of a foreign country. But I think the obvious answer is like he chooses that name because it isn't connected to this foreign state. He must not have liked that or not thought it was advantageous. And you know, that's the frustrating part because I'm like, this helped you all along the way, and now you want to throw it away. But maybe it's that he's sitting there for 20 years not getting any promotions in rank at the court, and so he's trying to find some way to break through beyond where he is. To my mind, the real problem is that he didn't have a close relationship with Konin and Kamu, right? Like he had that close relationship with Koken Shotaku, that helped him along the way. I think that's the problem, so I sort of like disagree with him about his own strategy. But yeah, beyond that, I don't know the Takakura name. It's not one that like clearly relates to other powerful families that I know of. And the best suggestion I've seen is that it's a place name that's in a like reasonably relevant place for him. So yeah, not a huge amount of an answer. I kind of want more as well. Like I want it to be clear why he picked it, but at best I'd say that's a pretty safe strategy in terms of choosing a name to ask for. Lots of people ask for place names and get them. Okay, let's see, one more from Ann Walthall. Okay, so Dr. Walthall asks, how do we know that people of power had the same or even similar notions of immigrant, the outsider in the community as we do now? After all, there are important immigrant communities much closer to the capital, the Hata, for example. It seems to me that immigrants filled a range of positions from elite to provincial that complicates what is meant by the category of immigrant. I completely agree. So I'm sort of clumsily using immigrant and foreign origin, foreign subject, descendants of immigrants to refer to what I actually think is a very heterogeneous group of people. So one of the things that I argued in my dissertation is that it's not really until the Shinsen Shojuroku, which is 815, that all foreigners are in one group. I think that the Hata, who've been there for hundreds of years by the time that other people arrive, are seen as totally separate, like not seen as immigrants in the sense that like these 7th century arrivals are. So if you think about, I don't have my slides up, but if you went back to Koken's edict, she specifically says people who arrive from Koguryo Pekche and Shila. She doesn't mean everybody. She means people who came in the 7th century, and that's who she's giving this grant to. But you do see these petitions where people are kind of trying to take advantage of the broadness of the grant to be like, yes, I am one of those people. And so over the course of the 8th century, I think older layers of people who couldn't trace their descent to somewhere else, but aren't meaningfully immigrants in that kind of 7th century arrival sense, they start to merge in a way that they weren't originally the same category. So that's still something that I'm kind of working on and working out, but I really do think that this is not all one group. So when we use Todaijin, or when we talk about Kikajin or immigrants even, it's actually hundreds and hundreds of years of people who've arrived, and they aren't at the time seen as one thing. I think it does tend towards merging into one category with the genealogical texts later on, where there's like that text is genealogy of court lineages, it's the emperor's line, those descended from local gods, and then various foreigners. So it's all of those people, the hata are in there, but also like the Kudara no Konikishi and the Koma no Asa. So at that point, they are in one category, but before that, I don't think they were. Am I missing something? Oh, okay, Sachiko's question from the chat. Totally agree with the importance of microhistory, yay. Microhistories are also like very fun to write and fun to read. It's really like delightful to think through everything from the perspective of one person. I really enjoyed this. So the question is, I'm wondering if you found female members' roles of Nara or Heian immigrant families, like mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters. Yes, and actually, Ellen von Goethem has a great article on the importance of Paekje women in Kammu's back palace. There were a lot of them, and they were quite important. Obviously, his mother is an important figure to him. He's talking about his maternal relatives, talking about the Kudara no Konikishi. So yeah, certainly can't remember much more in detail right now, but I would look at that article, and I would say that these women are definitely playing an important role in their families' status at court. And I think Iju and Yoko also has a great chapter or article where she breaks down how some of these women influenced their families' status at court. So how did their connections actually relate to people gaining status or getting new designations or things like that. So they were very important. In Fukushin's case, I just don't have a lot about that. So I don't know. I wish I knew who some of the women in his life were. I bet they were important, but unfortunately, that's not part of this record. So couldn't say much more about that. Oh, okay. One more question from Jason Lowe. So, okay. Quick note on the Kai Huso poems. Oh, thank you. I really don't know much about these. I just know that his name is in there. So as you know, the occasion of the gathering at Prince Nagaya's house is the entertainment of guests from Sheila. In Sena Koven's first poem, he says the purpose of the party is to celebrate, oh gosh, I don't know what this is. But what are they celebrating? Maybe you can put it in the chat. Okay, so he's saying that the purpose of the party to celebrate, literary folks typically take that term to mean, oh, kindred spirits or poetic camaraderie that is part and parcel of these gatherings. However, in the context of having visitors from abroad and Koblenz status, it may have political implications. So some of these transformations as well. In any case, this term has a place both in defining Confucian harmonious hierarchy, as well as the great unity, Strangzang great unity. I wonder whether you have seen the term crop up in any of the documents you've, so carefully reviewed. Interesting. No, I don't think so. I will go back and look, but that is clearly, as I have just read it, not very familiar to me. I haven't seen that much. I do know, I think there's a Sheila nun in the Manyoshu who uses the language of submitting and being transformed, that like Kikatoka language. So I haven't looked too far into that, but I know that she's kind of referencing that as an experience that she had. But I don't know, this is very fascinating. I will definitely go back and look for this term. So thank you so much for letting me know. But I haven't seen much of it yet. It's not in the petitions or things like that. So yeah. Okay.
Okay, well, Nadia, that was a barrage of questions, and we've got just a few minutes left, and I wonder if there aren't any more specifics. If you could use the remaining few minutes to say a little bit about like how you are envisioning this all coming together in, you know, some manuscript, or how you see these microhistories kind of building into a book or a longer article, or what's your? I think everybody would love to know what your kind of publication plans are.
Oh gosh. Well, you know, I really came to this having loved Amy Stanley's book, and then I really enjoyed in that ritualized writing book, Brian Lowe's, where the way that he talked about things both at a macro level and then used these micro histories to kind of make it more human. I think that's really satisfying, both in terms of understanding this world. We kind of need both, right? Like I very much enjoyed this micro history, but you need the context. You need to know what's going on and why this person stands out or why they're remarkable. So that was kind of what led me to this. And then also it is such a joy after you study at that macro level and you like make a database of all of this and you try to track everything and look at it in the big picture, to then go back and think like, how is one person getting through this? Was really satisfying and fun. And I also think it is a way, another thing I enjoyed about it is there was so much research on this time period. I feel like I left out huge amounts of things that would be interesting. Like, what does the Capitol look like? We actually know a lot about that. What is the provincial governor's role like? You know, there's so much about that that I couldn't include today. So what I want to do is kind of keep trying to build in more and more of that texture, try to really imagine the world that he's encountering and moving through. I skimmed right through all those rebellions. We actually have a good amount of detail about what's happening because there's for example, a whole series of almost comically like incoherent confessions from the plotters in the Nara rebellion. So there's so much more that could be incorporated here. And I am going to try to build that out. And my idea is that this could be an article that would give people some understanding of what it might be like to be an immigrant in this early court, or a descendant of an immigrant, really, and kind of complicate some of the claims that are often made about it. And then also complicate that idea that like the state or the court is doing stuff. Here you kind of see somebody navigating all of it and much more of the texture of how that worked. That was my aim here. I'm still working on the broader picture stuff. That was my dissertation, that's now the manuscript. And there, I think what I'm really working on is kind of bringing in more of what we know from archaeology. The publications that are coming out about that are just like, there's more and more of them in which they're kind of talking about immigrants specifically, and they're willing to say like a group of people came from somewhere else. They're really showing us just like how deep and complex and kind of long-standing all the relationships between Yamato and the Korean Peninsula, for example, are. So need more of that there. But yeah, that's kind of the idea for this particular piece. And I think it was a nice companion to have with the much broader view where I was looking at all of the law codes and trying to understand those, all of the policies, how are they implemented, and then this kind of court genealogy. Here I got to think about like one guy trying to make the best life he can as he navigates all of those changes in policies. So if anybody's considering writing microhistory, I can't recommend it enough. It's a very like human experience of doing this and satisfying in that sense.
Well, thank you so much, Nadia. You took us right to 5:30. So very much appreciate people taking time on a Monday for this talk, and all best of luck with your sabbatical and getting as much written during this time. So thank you, Nadia, for your presentation. I saw Jason had put something else in the chat as well, and might be good to get that notation as well. But thank you to Nadia. Thank you for everyone else attending today, all to the end. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.